Right now, something is happening in the Middle East that could change the entire region forever. The United States, under Donald Trump, is positioning one of the most battle-hardened fighting forces on Earth against Iran. But these fighters aren't American soldiers. They're not NATO troops. They're not from any country at all. They are the Kurds. 40 million people, one of the largest ethnic groups on the planet. And they don't have a country. No flag at the United Nations. No seat at any international table. No border that belongs to them. 40 million people scattered across 4 different nations, fighting everyone else's wars for over a century, and getting betrayed every single time. Now Trump wants them to fight again, this time against Iran. But before you can understand why that matters, you need to understand who the Kurds actually are, because their story is one of the most heartbreaking and extraordinary stories in human history. A story of a nation that has existed for thousands of years, but has never been allowed to exist on a map. But before we dive in, welcome to Simply History. We break down the most important stories in history and connect them to what's happening in the world right now. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And do us a quick favor. Drop a comment right now telling us what country you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now let's get into it. To understand why the Kurds are at the center of Trump's strategy against Iran, you first need to understand who they are and why they have no country. And this is where the story gets painful. The Kurds are one of the oldest ethnic groups in the Middle East. They've lived in the same mountainous region for over 4,000 years. Their homeland stretches across a vast area of rugged mountains and fertile valleys that today sits inside 4 different countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. This region is called Kurdistan, which literally means land of the Kurds. But here's the cruel irony. Kurdistan exists culturally. It exists geographically. It exists in the hearts and minds of 40 million people. But it does not exist politically. There's no country called Kurdistan on any official map in the world. The Kurds have their own language. Actually, they have several dialects, including Kurmanji and Sorani. They have their own music, their own poetry, their own clothing, their own traditions, their own food, their own identity. They have everything a nation needs to be a nation, except the one thing that makes it official: a state. Historians call this the Kurdish paradox. A nation in every sense of the word, except the one sense that the modern world recognizes. Now you're probably thinking, how is that possible? How can 40 million people not have their own country? The answer goes back to one of the biggest betrayals in modern history, and it started with a broken promise. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, the European powers sat down to redraw the map of the Middle East. The British and the French carved up the region like a birthday cake, creating new countries with rulers that served their interests. In 1920, a treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres was signed, and it included a provision for an independent Kurdish state. For the first and only time in modern history, the world's major powers officially agreed that the Kurds deserved their own country. The Kurds thought their dream was finally coming true. They were wrong. Within 3 years, the treaty was thrown out. A new treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923, and the Kurdish state was erased from it completely. Just like that. One signature, and the promise was dead. The land that was supposed to become Kurdistan was carved up and divided between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and a territory that would later become Syria. Now you're probably thinking, why? Why would the world promise the Kurds a country and then take it away? The answer is oil and power. The region that would have become Kurdistan sits on top of some of the largest oil reserves in the Middle East. Britain wanted control of the oil-rich areas around Mosul and Kirkuk, in what is now northern Iraq. Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was building a new powerful nation-state and refused to give up any territory to a Kurdish homeland. Iran was consolidating its own borders, and nobody with power cared enough about the Kurds to fight for them. This is what historians call the Great Betrayal, and it set the pattern for the next 100 years. The Kurds would be used when powerful nations needed them and abandoned the moment they were no longer useful. And that pattern is repeating right now with Trump and Iran. But we'll get to that. What followed the Great Betrayal was a century of suffering that most of the world has never heard about. In every country where the Kurds ended up, they were treated as a problem to be crushed. In Turkey, the Kurdish language was banned. Let that sink in. An entire people were told they could not speak their own language. The Turkish government didn't even acknowledge that Kurds existed. They called them Mountain Turks and pretended they were just Turkish people with a funny accent. Kurdish names were banned. Kurdish music was banned. Kurdish cultural expression was suppressed in every possible way. When the Kurds resisted, Turkey responded with military force. Entire villages were destroyed. Thousands were killed. The Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as the PKK, launched an armed insurgency in 1984 that has killed tens of thousands of people on both sides and continues to this day. In Iran, the Kurds faced similar oppression. In 1946, the Kurds briefly established the Republic of Mohabbat, a tiny independent Kurdish state in northwestern Iran. It lasted less than 1 year. The Iranian government crushed it, executed its president, and reasserted total control over Kurdish regions. Kurdish political movements in Iran have been suppressed ever since, with activists imprisoned, tortured, and executed. But the worst horrors happened in Iraq, and this is the part of the story that should make your blood run cold. In the late 1980s, Saddam Hussein launched a campaign against the Iraqi Kurds called Al-Anfal. The word Anfal comes from the Quran and means the spoils of war. But there were no spoils. There was only death. Saddam's forces systematically attacked Kurdish villages across northern Iraq. They used chemical weapons. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi warplanes flew over the Kurdish town of Halabja and dropped bombs filled with mustard gas, sarin, tabun, and VX nerve agents on the civilian population. Imagine standing in your kitchen making breakfast for your children, and suddenly the air turns poisonous. People collapsed in the streets. Mothers died clutching their babies. Entire families were found frozen in their last moments, faces twisted in agony, skin burned by chemicals. Between 3,200 and 5,000 people were killed in Halabja in a single day. The youngest victims were infants. Throughout the entire Al-Anfal campaign, an estimated 50,000 to 182,000 Kurdish civilians were killed. Thousands of villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. It was genocide by every definition of the word. And what did the world do? Almost nothing. The United States was actually supporting Saddam Hussein at the time because he was fighting against Iran. American officials knew about the chemical attacks and chose to look the other way. The Kurds were gassed with chemical weapons, and the world shrugged. Remember that when we talk about Trump using the Kurds against Iran, because the Kurds remember. They remember every single time. Now here's where the story shifts, and where the Kurds went from forgotten people to the most important fighters in the Middle East. In 2014, a force of pure evil emerged from the chaos of the Syrian civil war and the collapse of Iraq, the Islamic State, ISIS. Within months, ISIS had conquered territory the size of the United Kingdom. They declared a caliphate, a religious empire stretching across Syria and Iraq. They were beheading journalists on camera. They were burning prisoners alive in cages. They were enslaving thousands of Yazidi women and girls, a Kurdish minority group, selling them in markets like objects. They were destroying ancient archaeological sites that had survived for thousands of years. The Iraqi army, which the United States had spent billions of dollars training, collapsed. Entire divisions of Iraqi soldiers threw down their weapons, stripped off their uniforms, and ran. The most expensive military project in American history crumbled in days. But the Kurds didn't run. When ISIS reached the borders of Kurdish territory, the Kurds stood and fought. In northern Iraq, the peshmerga, which translates to those who face death, mobilized to defend Kurdish cities and villages. In northern Syria, the YPG and YPJ, which included thousands of female fighters, organized defensive lines against ISIS. The image of young Kurdish women carrying rifles and fighting against the most brutal terrorist organization on earth captured the world's attention overnight. These weren't soldiers from a superpower. These were farmers, teachers, students, mothers, daughters, and grandparents who picked up weapons because there was nobody else to protect their families. The battle for Kobani in 2014 became the turning point. ISIS surrounded this small Kurdish city in northern Syria and poured in thousands of fighters. The world watched live on television as Kurdish fighters defended every block, every building, every street. American warplanes provided air support, but on the ground it was the Kurds alone facing the ISIS war machine. After months of brutal urban combat, the Kurds won. Kobani didn't fall. It was the first major defeat for ISIS, and it proved that the so-called unstoppable caliphate could be beaten. And the people who beat it were a nation without a country. From that point forward, the United States made the Kurds their primary ground force in the war against ISIS. American weapons, American training, American intelligence, American air support all flowed to Kurdish fighters. Together they liberated city after city, Manbij, Tabqa, and finally Raqqa, the capital of the ISIS caliphate itself. Kurdish fighters paid for that victory with thousands of lives. Over 11,000 Kurdish fighters were killed in the war against ISIS. They did the dying while America did the bombing, and they won. Now you'd think that after sacrificing 11,000 lives to destroy ISIS on America's behalf, the Kurds would finally get what they'd been promised for a century: recognition, protection, maybe even a state. You'd be wrong, because what happened next was the most predictable and the most painful chapter in the Kurdish story. In October 2019, President Trump made a phone call to Turkish President Erdogan. Turkey had been furious about American support for Kurdish forces in Syria because Turkey considers many Kurdish groups to be terrorist organizations. After that phone call, Trump ordered American troops to withdraw from Kurdish territory in northern Syria. Within hours, Turkey launched a military invasion of those same Kurdish areas. The very areas that Kurdish fighters had liberated from ISIS with American support were now being bombed by a NATO ally of the United States. Kurdish fighters who had been standing beside American soldiers just days before suddenly found themselves under attack with no American support. Communities that had celebrated the defeat of ISIS now fled Turkish airstrikes. People who had trusted America were running for their lives. A Kurdish general told reporters, "You are leaving us to be slaughtered." An American Special Forces soldier stationed in Syria reportedly told his commanders that he was ashamed for the first time in his career. The Kurds call this pattern the oldest story. They help a powerful nation fight its wars. They bleed. They sacrifice. They win. And then that powerful nation walks away and leaves them to face the consequences alone. It happened after World War I, when Britain promised them a state and then gave their land away. It happened after the Gulf War, when George H.W. Bush encouraged the Kurds to rise up against Saddam and then watched Saddam slaughter them. It happened in 2019, when Trump abandoned them to Turkey. And now it's about to happen again, because Trump is back and he wants the Kurds to fight Iran. Now let's talk about what's happening right now and why it matters. The United States and Iran are locked in one of the most dangerous confrontations in decades. Iran's nuclear program is advancing. Iran's proxy forces across the Middle East are more powerful than ever. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, all funded and armed by Tehran. Trump has made confronting Iran a central pillar of his foreign policy. But here's the problem. The American public has zero appetite for another major ground war in the Middle East. After Afghanistan and Iraq, sending hundreds of thousands of American troops into another Middle Eastern conflict is political suicide. So Trump needs someone else to do the fighting. And the Kurds are the perfect candidate. Here's why. First, Kurdish territory sits directly on Iran's western border. Iraqi Kurdistan and Iranian Kurdistan share a long mountainous border that Iranian security forces have struggled to fully control for decades. Kurdish fighters know those mountains better than anyone. They've been fighting in them for generations. Second, millions of Kurds live inside Iran itself. An estimated 8 to 12 million Kurds live in western Iran, and they have their own history of resistance against the Iranian government. Kurdish political groups inside Iran have fought against Tehran for decades. Activating Kurdish resistance inside Iran could create an internal security crisis that would distract and weaken the Iranian regime. Third, the Kurds are battle-tested. They just spent years fighting ISIS in some of the most brutal combat conditions imaginable. They are experienced, organized, motivated, and effective. No other group in the region offers the same combination of geographic position, military capability, and willingness to fight. For Trump, the equation is simple. Use Kurdish fighters as a proxy force against Iran, so that American soldiers don't have to do the dying. It's the same strategy America has used with the Kurds before. In the 1970s, the CIA armed Kurdish rebels in Iraq to pressure Saddam Hussein on behalf of the Shah of Iran. The moment the Shah and Saddam reached a deal, America cut off support overnight. Henry Kissinger reportedly said covert action should not be confused with missionary work. The Kurds were expendable then. The question is whether they're expendable now. But here's what makes this moment different from every previous chapter. And this is the part that should worry everyone. The Kurds are walking into a trap, and they know it. If the Kurds agree to fight Iran on Trump's behalf, they gain short-term American support, weapons, money, intelligence, and political backing. But they also paint a massive target on their backs. Iran will respond with overwhelming force against Kurdish communities both in Iraq and inside Iran. Turkey will use any Kurdish military buildup as justification for its own attacks on Kurdish positions. And if Trump loses interest, makes a deal with Iran, or simply changes his mind, the Kurds will be abandoned again, just like every time before. But if the Kurds refuse to cooperate with Trump, they risk losing American support entirely. Without American backing, Kurdish regions in Iraq and Syria become vulnerable to pressure from Iran, Turkey, and Baghdad simultaneously. The Kurds are stuck between two impossible choices: fight someone else's war and risk destruction, or refuse to fight and risk abandonment. Historians call this the Kurdish dilemma, and it has defined Kurdish politics for the last 100 years. Every generation of Kurdish leaders has faced the same impossible choice, and every generation has been burned by it. And yet, despite everything, despite a century of betrayal, despite chemical weapons and genocide, despite being used as pawns by every major power in the region, despite losing thousands of fighters in wars that weren't theirs, the Kurdish dream refuses to die. There's a Kurdish saying that captures this perfectly. The Kurds have no friends but the mountains. It means that throughout history, every ally has eventually betrayed them. Every promise has eventually been broken. Every partnership has eventually ended with the Kurds standing alone. The only thing that has never abandoned them is the land itself, the mountains where they were born and where they've survived for 4,000 years. But here's what that saying misses. The Kurds also have each other. 40 million people bound together by a language, a culture, a history, and a dream that has survived everything the world has thrown at it. They have poets who write about a homeland they've never seen on a map. They have mothers who teach their children Kurdish songs in countries where those songs were once illegal. They have fighters who go to war knowing they might never come home, fighting for a nation that doesn't officially exist. They have old men who still carry the keys to villages that were destroyed decades ago, just like the Palestinians carry keys to the homes they lost in 1948. The Kurdish story is not just a political story. It's a human story. A story about what happens when the world draws lines on a map without asking the people who live there. A story about what it means to belong to a nation that everyone recognizes, but nobody is willing to create. A story about the cruelty of geopolitics and the resilience of identity. Right now, Donald Trump is positioning the Kurds as his front line against Iran, just like America positioned them against ISIS, just like America positioned them against Saddam, just like Britain positioned them against the Ottomans. The faces in Washington change. The strategy never does. Find the Kurds, arm the Kurds, use the Kurds, and when the job is done, leave. 40 million people, 4,000 years of history, the largest nation on earth without a country. They've survived empires, genocides, betrayals, and chemical weapons. They've defeated the most dangerous terrorist organization of the 21st century with their bare hands. They've bled for other people's freedom while being denied their own. And they're still here, still fighting, still dreaming, still waiting for a world that will finally keep its promise. The mountains are watching. They always are. If this video changed how you see the Kurds, subscribe to Simply History. We tell the stories that the world needs to hear. the stories of people who history books forgot and powerful nations used. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in the Middle East right now. Drop a comment below telling us what country you're watching from and whether you think the Kurds will ever get their own country. We read every single comment. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.